Good evening, fellow heretics. Welcome back to Nerds and Heresy. I feel like it's been a while. I missed you guys. I really have. I feel like we don't hang out like we used to. Anyway, our guest tonight is an Edward Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham and a research associate at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University and former teacher at the University of Notre Dame. Most of her work focuses on martyrdom, persecution, disability, enslavement, and other issues that affect marginalized groups. Please welcome Dr. Candida Moss. Oh, wait, I messed up. Where's my intro video? Okay, please welcome.
Hold on to your butts.
Nothing but strict professionalism here on Nerds and Heresy. How you doing, Dr. Candida?
I am doing really well. Thanks for having me on, Rick. I love that intro, by the way. I love the dystopian Chronicles of Riddick feel.
Thank you. I made it myself. What I tell everybody is that's the highlight of the show. It's all downhill from here. Like, wow, as soon as I start speaking, like the production quality just plummets. As soon as I start talking. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. We've been working on this for a little while. We've gotten to interact a few times on TikTok. Which, by the way, you guys, all of the links and Dr. Candida's goings on in the social media realm is in the description below. Highly recommend giving her a follow. There's also a link where you can purchase the books we'll be talking about. Definitely, I might be biased, but check out her TikTok because I love your TikToks. I really do.
Thank you.
You use a lot of visual aids in your videos, which I'm a very visual learner, so I enjoy that very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. So you wrote a book. It's been a little while, but you wrote a book called "The Myth of Persecution." The early Christians, how the early Christians invented stories of martyrdom. When I picked up this book, I was expecting it to be all about like how the persecution in the early church didn't really happen, at least not the way we're so used to hearing it. And you go into that a lot, but you go into so much more. There's just a lot more. You go like far back in history of how persecution sort of kind of started and then evolved over time with different cultures and different characters. And really, yeah, it was really, really fun to read. So my first question is going to be, what was your overall goal in writing this book? What were you hoping to convey to your audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for having me on. I'm really thrilled to be here. And it's always, I'm an academic. I sit in libraries alone a lot. So it's amazing to think of people actually read the things I write. So when I wrote this book, I was teaching at Notre Dame. I had been very fortunate to be promoted really soon. And I had written 2 books on martyrdom and early Christianity. But this was sort of I'm going to say it was like beginning of the Obama years, and it's a Catholic institution, as you know, and a lot of people around me were talking about how Catholics and Christians were like being persecuted in America, and then I'd overhear these snippets of conversation. I'd like follow the news, and I'd be like, persecuted? What are you all talking about? And they would often reference the early church, and I'm an early church historian, and we scholars have known, this is a project that's been going on for, I'm not kidding, 400 years, that the stories of martyrs are wildly exaggerated, that there really was no systematic persecution. And in writing the book, I was like, I need to stop people from claiming that they're persecuted and thinking they're persecuted automatically like the early church. And so part of the goal of the book was like, let me tell you the history that scholars know about the lack of persecution and where these stories come from. And that's not just like a scholarly endeavor. There were Catholic priests who were like you guys, we need to stop this. This is embarrassing. And part of the goal was like, I I was teaching at a very Catholic institution, where a lot of people felt like sort of their place in the world was, they were this kind of persecuted minority in America who, are this very wealthy institution, like with enough money to pay for tuition or being paid by this extraordinarily well-endowed university. And I was like, what are you talking about? We're in South Bend, Indiana. No one's coming to get us. So that was my goal. I was sort of let me just tell you the history, the kinds of things I've already been writing books about, and maybe we could get a reality check.
Okay.
And, I think what I didn't anticipate was the hate. It did make me very popular there.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Yeah, I grew up charismatic Pentecostal, and I went to the University of Valley Forge for theology and apologetics. So one thing I heard a lot was this idea that the reason we can trust the resurrection accounts is because the earliest disciples all died for this belief. They refused, and turns out that not exactly the case. We'll get a little bit more into that later, but imagine we talked all about how Paul was beheaded for his beliefs, right? So imagine my surprise when I learned that the first account of that was the Acts of Paul. He's beheaded, and milk spews out of his neck stump and gets all over the people, the execution. And I'm like, that's the evidence we have for that? That's really what we're going with? Now, it's very possible Paul was, maybe even likely that he was beheaded, but that's beside the point. Like, this is where this legendary account came from. Sorry, rambling. This was a very common teaching that we got a lot. So hearing these different perspectives from historians, and to hear that other Christians are saying, yeah, that's not how that happened, that's still weird to me to this day. Like, really? Wow, I was really in a bubble, wasn't I? Didn't even realize it.
I mean, I heard that too. I also heard that, frankly, in retrospect, kind of nonsensical argument that obviously Jesus was really resurrected from the dead. Otherwise, people wouldn't have suffered and died for him. And it's funny because there's so much we don't know about the circumstances of their arrests and trials and execution. But also, now in 2024, it's very clear people will die for a lot of things. Clearly being willing to be a martyr is not proof that your religious beliefs are correct. Otherwise, that would mean that every religious group was correct.
Right. Yeah, I grew up. Are you at all familiar? I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit. But that's okay. Are you at all familiar with the Jesus Freak series by DC Talk?
Yes.
It was all the rage in the early 2000s. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's 3 volumes of them. I think the third one was all women. It was all just stories of people who were martyred. And I read all of them, and you started develop this fantasy of dying the death of a martyr. And there's one story I remember specifically. It's probably not the craziest story at all, but it's the one that stood with me for some reason. It was it was either in China or Russia. There was a Christian they put out in the snow, took all his clothes off, and just left him there overnight to freeze to death. And then the soldiers would go up all bundled up in their coats, like, are you ready to renounce Jesus yet? Are you ready? And the Holy Spirit kept this guy warm. He was just like, no, I'm fine. And you read the stories, and you're like, wow, that's crazy. And you're not supposed to question that, because these are men of God who are writing these books and telling these stories. They wouldn't lie to you. So we're, was already exposed to that kind of propaganda and bought into it. And then you start thinking did this actually happen the way this story is telling because they don't give any citations or evidence for their claim. They're just words
Right.
on paper. And you're supposed to take their word for it. Sorry, I went off again. It's probably gonna happen a lot during stream.
Inspires me.
I'm excited. I'm nervous. So like I said, I alluded to earlier in the book, you go through a long history of martyrdom and persecution, and the biggest myth about it is that this is a terrible thing that nobody wanted. When the reality is, this was a very coveted way to go out. Like people wanted to die in some sort of glorious manner. What are some examples from early history of this? Like how far does this go back, and what was the mindset that drove this kind of design?
Yeah,
Is that question?
they did. Okay, so let's just start with martyrdom as just a concept. It makes, if you believe in God, martyrdom makes excellent sense, right? You have what? Let's say generously, 21st century, you have 80 years, maybe. And then you have an eternity after that, either in heaven or in hell. An eternity, right? So, should you spend your time now serving God and ideally dying as a martyr if it means you get to go directly to heaven? Yes, absolutely. That is the surest investment strategy ever. That's just excellent investing. So, in terms of why someone would be a martyr, this is not a nonsensical thing if you buy into this worldview. And there were
Right.
early Christians have their religious leader was executed by the Romans. So they have a model of what would God do? Well, God would die. That's what God would do if he was brought into a Roman courtroom. And as a result, and especially you have these developing ideas that martyrs will go straight to heaven, whereas other people have to wait for Judgment Day. And then there's going to be a judgment. And I don't know about you, but it's not looking good. I've read a lot of accounts of hell. It seems like you go to hell for some very small things, like not paying attention in church. So, it's not looking good for me. And
Yeah.
and for early Christians, on the other hand, there's this get out of jail free card of martyrdom. And there are lots of people who revere noble death. If you've seen the movie The 300, you know that ancient Greeks revere dying for nation. If you've read the Hebrew Bible, you know the stories of Daniel in the lion's den. You may have heard the stories of the Maccabees. And the 2 chapters of that book about martyrs. You may have heard about the last holdouts at Masada. You may have read the death of Socrates. Lots of people think that dying well is the path to immortality and sort of the best way to go out. And so then you have these early Christians who are raised in this broader culture that reveres a good death. And we have these stories emerging. There's one story told by an early church figure known as Tertullian. He says, well, in Asia Minor, that's Turkey, this crowd of 2,000 Christians went to the Roman governor and they demanded to be executed for being Christians. And apparently he just turned them away. He was like, look, it's the middle of the night. If you want to die, you have ropes to hang yourself with, and just shut the door. I think it's an amazing story. But then we have other Christians who are putting up their hands and saying, I'm a Christian, execute me, during someone else's trial. This is not.
Yeah, wasn't it
some people are speaking out?
Yeah, wasn't it Ignatius, correct me if I'm wrong, who was like, you will martyr, I will make you martyr. Don't anybody stop them from martyring. I will die the death of a martyr. Yeah, you had these people that were very much antagonizing this.
Yeah, he wrote a letter to the church in Rome, who we didn't even know, being like, don't get in the way, don't interfere. I long to be food for wild beasts. And I kind of humorously in my head imagine them getting it and being like, dude, we don't even know you. But I'm sure they might have interfered. But what's interesting about Ignatius is that Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist, was like, this guy has issues. This guy has this particular kind of pathological desire to die.
I didn't know this.
Yes, as having this love of death. Not just Ignatius, many early Christians. And there is like a
Sure.
whole school of historian and psychiatrist who's like, something is up with these early Christians. They're deranged. Why are they doing this? They find it very embarrassing. But that's not what Christians think. Christians hold them up as saints and heroes and martyrs. I know I did when I was raised. These are great stories.
Sure.
They're inspiring.
They are. So you mentioned Socrates a minute ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to talk a little bit about that because I know a little bit about Socrates. I know a lot about Jesus, but I never made the kind of connections between the two that you laid out in your book. So for those who don't know, in the chat, Socrates is regarded as the wisest man who ever lived, but he didn't write anything down. Everything we know about him was written by his disciples and some critics. He was charged with, or he was sentenced to death, and he had to drink poison. So it's starting to sound familiar, right? But you post this, or you posit this argument kind of blew my mind, and I think about it a lot. That the manner in which he died was heavily glorified by his followers. Again, sounds familiar, right? And so you suggest that maybe if his death was not glorified in that manner by his followers, we might not know much about him. He might have faded into historical obscurity.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and why you said that?
Yeah. I mean, really, the way that Plato tells the story, he tells the story both of his death and of his trial, really kind of sets a bow on the whole Socratic legend. When you read the trial, it's clearly politically motivated, and you come away with two impressions. One, he didn't really do anything wrong, and two, he's not trying to get out of this at all. When during his trial, when they say to him, how do you think we should punish you? He could have said, how about exile? Doesn't say that. He's like, I think that you should feed me and put me up at your expense for the rest of my life. I mean, at that point, it's a little bit red rag to a bull. So obviously they sentence him to die. And then you have this story that Plato tells of his actual death, and his friends come, and he's very, very composed. Why is this important? Because philosophy is a lot about how to live your life with self-restraint, not giving into passions like anger. And when you see someone die the way Socrates dies, calmly, in full control of his body, of his emotions, you're like, wow.
Very stoic.
He's the real deal, that he could do it, because for sure I would go to pieces. We admire that. We admire people who can die this kind of, good death, embodying the example that they tell everyone else to live. This guy was not a hypocrite, according to the story. He drinks some poison. He makes a funny joke about how they should offer a cockerel to Asclepius because he's been healed of living, and then he dies. You have other stories of deaths of philosophers who just are completely unmoved by the tortures being visited upon them. And these are inspiring stories. They create a cult of personality around those individuals. It's one of the reasons why today you have to be very careful if you want to kill one of your enemies. You don't want to martyr someone who's a leader of the opposition. And so I think that, when you think about Socrates, the extent to which Socrates would be as important as he is today, that's down to Plato. And for Plato, a lot of that is about how Socrates was treated at the end of his life. And that legend of Socrates, of his death, creates an example for all kinds of philosophers, and affects even the way that the death of Jesus is presented in, for example, the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is in full control of himself there.
Perfect segue. Oh, you nailed that. That's my next question, is getting into into Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Going back to the parallels of Jesus, I've talked about this a lot and how the character or the person of Jesus and the manner of his death like evolved over time to make him seem more and more like heroic. Like you start off with Mark 15, where he's like, "My God," the last thing he says on the cross is, my God, why are you forsaking me?" It's a very, very human moment that he has. But then you get like to John, written 30, 40-ish years later, John 19, he says, "It is finished." Like he's a superhero.
Yeah.
And Matthew and Luke bridge that kind of gap. So, what is can you explain what happens? What's happening there? What is the reason for this change in the narrative structure of the story? And are there other? Can you find a similar pattern of development with other historic figures like Socrates or anybody else?
Socrates does get a little more heroic, but there is never, for Socrates, there's no Gospel of Mark. Mark's Jesus, Eli lama sabachthani passage you mentioned, the cry of abandonment, of desolation, his last words. But not just that, like he's in the Garden of Gethsemane the night, he's a wreck. He's begging God to live, and like God says no, apparently. And he like throws himself on the ground in Mark. And then you get to Luke. Luke has Mark, and Luke takes that stuff right out. There's no throwing yourself on the ground. There's no, he's sweating droplets of blood in one manuscript of Luke, not the earliest manuscript. But, Luke has Jesus composed, philosophical, on the cross. There's no sense of abandonment. By the time we get to John, like you said, that last word in Greek is tetelestai, which is like it's finished or it's perfected. He's like, look, everything was perfect. And then he like, cashes out like to return to. So it's why does this happen? It's so obvious. We look at Jesus and Mark and we're like, oh, it's a very human death. And it is a very human death. I think we can all picture ourselves in that mode. It's what makes that story so powerful for people who lived in the first century, who had suffered and experienced great hardships. This was a story of the death of someone that like got them. But Luke and John, and to a similar extent Matthew, they look at that and they're like, this is embarrassing, because Jesus doesn't even die like a little girl. Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who was sacrificed so that the Greeks who fought the battle at Troy in the Trojan War, so that they could get a wind to sail to Troy to get back Helen. She was sacrificed in order to get that fair wind. And she, in Greek plays, she gives this long speech. She's apparently 11. Any of you who have like 11-year-olds. And she gives this long speech about how her death is going to be for the Greek people, and how the victory at Troy, that will be her children. By the way, like 15 minutes beforehand, she thought she had been brought there to marry Achilles, who, according to modern cinema, is Brad Pitt. So this has been like quite the 180 for her. So she gives this like speech about the meaningfulness of her death, and then she just like calmly walks up to be sacrificed to a sort of minor goddess. That's how a little girl dies in Greek epic. Jesus is begging for his life by comparison. So this is sort of it is so strikingly different that Luke and John, who want to present Jesus as this philosophical deity, in John's case, I think we can talk about John thinking that Jesus was a deity incarnate. For Luke, he's just like, Jesus is going to die like a philosopher. And he takes everything that might be considered embarrassing out and has him die like with full composure.
Sorry, I got distracted. You focus a lot on Luke and Acts, I think more than any of the other Gospels in this book, as sort of like a transitional period between this, like, the two different ways of thinking. You argue that the author of Luke is trying to portray Jesus as being like a second Socrates, kind of similar to how
Mm-hmm.
Paul is trying to depict him as being a second Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Two-part question. First part: was it about what is it about the books of Luke's and Acts that you focus so much on, or that you think is such a pivotal point in the development of the story? And this idea of being a second Socrates or a second Adam, um, was this was this a common trope, like in ancient literature? Like, and if it was, was it to say, like, here's a newer, more improved version? Like, you've heard of this guy. This is that guy, but with the latest iOS update, right? Or was it to say this guy's teachings were so powerful that people are still imitating him to this day? Um, yeah, I feel like I went all over the place there. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I think I know what you mean. So the reason I focus on Luke and Acts is because Luke is sort of this interesting bridge. You have the death of Jesus, full composure, as I've said, and then in Acts, you have the death of Stephen in Acts 7. And the death of Stephen has clear literary parallels to the death of Jesus. And again, and this is
yes,
very
it does.
similar, this Socrates, you have this, like, he gives a speech that enrages the crowd, which is why they stone him. And when you read the speech, you're like, yeah, no, that was kind of brutal of him. He was trash talking them, which doesn't mean that you should take up rocks and stone people. That's not what any of us would tell our kids. But he is inciting them in a kind of Socratic way. And then he dies in perfect imitation of Jesus. And what's interesting about it, that is, we now have our first example of someone imitating Jesus by dying. And that you should do what Jesus does thing, the what would Jesus do movement, the bracelets, that idea, that's woven throughout the New Testament. In Mark, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. You have Stephen imitating Jesus literally. You have the author of the deeply problematic First Peter telling people that when they suffer, they're imitating the suffering of Christ. You have the Gospel of John talking about laying down your life for your friends. So there's this sort of there's a shift that happens in Luke Acts of seeing the deaths of people who die like Jesus for Jesus as being like Jesus in some important way, that this is what you're supposed to do. If the opportunity arises, what would Jesus do? Jesus would die. So I think that's one of the reasons I focus on Luke Acts. In terms of, is this a thing people do? This is a thing people do. And I know you've spoken to Dr. Robin Walsh. When you think about how people write in antiquity, there's a lot of what we would call mimesis, like imitation. When you learn how to read and write, you learn how to write like Homer, right? Like Socrates. That would be a classroom assignment. Rewrite the story in the style of Homer, but from the perspective of a gnat, for example. So, this idea, also your wife is talking to you in the chat. So this
Yeah,
idea of
I'm gonna mute my. I was gonna mute my mic.
this idea of, like, sort of taking a literary trope and repeating it. That's just how people are writing in this period. It's how you learn to write in school. No one's really worried about plagiarism here. This is how you learn to write. And I think probably the best example of that is Virgil's Aeneid, which is just a Latin version of Homer. It is so ripping off the Greeks. And this is like such a Roman philosophical thing of just of taking a Greek thing and making it Roman. Like their architecture, their artwork. Like, look at Roman sculptures and you're like, okay, so they really like Greek artwork. And so this is just sort of how people do all kinds of artistic endeavors in this moment. And the idea of taking the story of Socrates and saying, well, we're going to rewrite the story of Jesus to make him sound like Socrates, to communicate this point that he's a great philosopher and teacher, that's just pretty standard in this time.
Perfect. Thank you. Moving right along with that same theme, I wanted to get a little bit into Polycarp, or the Martyrdom of Polycarp. This is probably the earliest account we have of Christian persecution or martyrdom outside of the New Testament. There are some debates depending on how you categorize certain things.
Yeah.
It's a whole thing we don't need to do, but it's very, very early, probably the earliest. But this is like 100, 130-ish years after the death of Jesus. And just like Luke is maybe trying to portray Jesus as being similar to Socrates, the author of the Martyrdom of Polycarp, or authors, there could be multiple, wasn't written by Polycarp himself, obviously, but it's probably written by his followers or someone in his community. Anyway, they parallel his passion narrative, I'll call it, so closely to Jesus. It borders on like blasphemy. Like, it copies everything. Like, it's like the same story. So what you just said about how like this is how they learn how to write is by copying these stories. Like, that makes perfect sense. So is that kind of why we see all these different examples of blatant parallelism in the ancient world where plagiarism is not a thing? This was, like you said, normal.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's so funny, that story. There's a particular kind of Christian who needs that story to be early for a number of reasons, like to show Christians as separate from Jews, to kind of cement Polycarp as this important figure. And he's one of the first people I wrote about, and that story is written down much later. It's clearly, there's so many elements that are fabricated. The idea that Polycarp happened to be arrested by a guy called Herod, what are the chances? And then just amazing.
Let me go through it real quick, just so y'all in the audience understand. This will be real quick. 3 times he's described as performing a kind of martyrdom in accordance with the gospel. Before his arrest, he hears rumors of persecution. He goes outside the city. He prophesies his own death and awaits his arrest. He's betrayed by someone close to him, and he prays for the captain of the police, who is, like you pointed out, named Herod. Weird. They come and arrest him. He's arrested at night, and then he enters the city on the back of a donkey. And while the crowd is like egging on like his persecution, he instructs. He's entrusted by a heavenly voice speaks to him to encourage him, and he's executed on the Passover. And when he's executed, I can't remember how he's executed. But
he's set on fire, but the fire billows out like a flame, and he bakes, right, and everyone smells bread. And he also does this like thing of holding out his arms in this cross-like shape. It's a whole thing.
And blood gushes out from his side somehow too, right?
Yes, and then like blood gushes out from his side and quenches the flames. I mean, it has something for everyone if you were reading the gospel story.
It's crazy. Oh my gosh, yeah. Like how can you read that and I'd be like, something's going on here? Why is this the same story? Yeah, okay. Fun part. Are you ready to move on to the next question? Or do you have more?
I am if you are.
I have a video I want you to watch. And get your reaction to it. Let me just figure out how to do this. I recently rearranged my desk, and now my second monitor is like up here, and it used to be over here.
Oh yeah, that'll throw you.
So now it's like I'm trying to. Are you familiar with who James Warner Wallace is?
I'm about to learn.
Beautiful. I love it when a scholar is asked, "Do you know who this apologist is?" and you all say no. That is music. Oh my God. Thank you. Like Bart Ehrman at one point said he didn't know who Frank Turek was, and I was like, oh, be still my soul. That's so fun to hear. Okay. Just a second. Do. I think this is the one. There we go. Oh, we got they put us at the bottom this time. That's different. Okay. Screen. This is only 3 minutes long, but I really wanted you to see it and get your raw, visceral reaction to it. Can you hear it? First of all,
Not yet, but maybe that's because it's paused.
was there sound? Just
I can't hear him. Can you turn on? Oh, and I'm in the way of the closed captions. I can't hear him.
what? Why are you doing this to me right now, StreamYard? Normally, it has our camera feeds on the side. I don't know why it's putting.
But I see as martyrs, so that's exciting. Did the apostles die as martyrs? Is the title of the video.
Yeah. Hold on. We're gonna figure this out. Sports. Is it really not the one that's? Why are you doing this to me right now? Nope, that's not it. That's maybe. Okay, so maybe you can follow the subtitles now if you can't hear it.
How do we know they died as martyrs? Okay, perfect.
Let me make sure the captions are on. There we go. Okay, real quick. Since you don't know who he is, James Warner Wallace was a former prosecuting attorney or a special detective for 40
Clearly an atheist. Okay.
Claims to be an atheist. He became Christian because he fell in love with a girl and became Christian magically, as the story usually goes. But now he uses his elite detective skills to go back and study the historical claims of the resurrection and everything. It says, using my knowledge as a prosecuting attorney, these stories are true. It's bananas.
So it's like Law and Order New Testament version?
Yes.
Dun,
very
dun.
much. But it's real. He's for real.
Okay. I love how he says first century when we have so few first century traditions and none for the deaths of the apostles.
It gets better.
Oh, well, if he has friends. Am I not supposed to make fun while I watch?
I don't know why there's no audio, guys. Sorry. Streamer changed things around.
Oh.
Almost done.
We don't have any first century sources. What is he talking about? We don't have a silence on any side. Sorry.
1 more minute. Hang in there. I don't know how much worse it'd be if you didn't. $15 seconds.
Okay, the apostles were. Oh, even according to the Gospels, they weren't there when he died. They were hiding in the upper room. What is he talking about? If he says
Okay.
evidential anymore, like, you have to take a shot.
Yeah, this is a big time apologist who runs around with Frank Turek and like William Lane Craig, and says all these things to a very large audience. And he writes books about them. It's like, you're wrong. But anyway, your reaction. Let's hear it.
Oh, very compelling. No. So here's the problem. His argument is we have all of this first century evidence for the deaths of the apostles, and we don't have any competing evidence that they lived long lives. We don't have any first century evidence for the deaths of the apostles. All of our stories for the deaths of Peter, Paul, Philip, Thomas, all of those people, that's second century, and also late second century. We're talking about a gap of a century. And so I'm just like, firstly,
which is a long time in the ancient world.
Yeah. What do you, and those stories, I mean, if you think that there are things to doubt about New Testament stories, then reading those stories, which are based on actual romance novels, like Greek romance novels, that's where they're drawing their like narrative structure. Those are not compelling historical evidence of anything, but they're certainly written a century later. And then the other thing is, they died as martyrs and they didn't recant their faith. It would not have mattered. So like at a certain point in the Roman judicial process, now firstly, all of those stories about the deaths of the apostles, why did they die? Usually because they got in the way of a Roman governor. Certainly not because they believe in Jesus. That doesn't even come up in those stories. No one's like, do you believe in Jesus? Then you have to die. They're like, stop telling my mistress to stop sleeping with me. Like, you're very annoying. And that's the like main theme of those stories. Has absolutely nothing to do with like anyone claiming that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. That might have been the motivating factor for the apostle wandering around seeing stuff, but the real reason they get arrested is for telling rich Roman women to stop having sex with their husbands. So it doesn't have anything to do with that. And then let's assume these were historical stories, which they're not. What we don't know is what would have happened. We have a few examples of people allegedly recanting their beliefs, but they do that long before they're brought to the arena. I don't know what Polycarp or Peter is thinking when they're actually there, because I'm pretty sure that I would be like, oh, I've made a terrible error. Now that I'm in the arena and I see the leopard, I'd like to recant, please.
I immediately regret this decision.
Yeah, I don't know how we would know that. And he's absolutely wrong about our evidence. I'm just not really sure where he clearly just never looked at the dating of any of these texts he's talking about. He just assumes they're first century because they said they were, which seems like not good practice. And I'm concerned about our judicial system. I'd like to get Gregory House in, who assumes that everybody is lying rather than this guy, you know, like you're a prosecutor. People have lied to you.
Yeah. And that's without getting into his whole claim that these were eyewitnesses. Like, that's a whole nother thing that we don't even have to get into.
Yeah, feel free. We don't have, I mean, I'm not sure. We certainly have texts that claim that eyewitness reports of martyrdom stories, but analysis of them have shown that that's not what they are. But in terms of like the apostles were eyewitnesses of the crucifixion, I mean, like there's that one guy in the Gospel of John, but like in Mark, there were just some women there. So I'm just like I'm very confused about all of this, and I'm sort of glad that I didn't know who he was. You know, I realized I don't only keep up with the world of apologists because I don't know, I was raised Roman Catholic rather than Protestant, but yeah, alarming. Nice subtitles that he had put on. Like, I like that kind of feel, very like, you know, NBC.
Yeah, I apologize for subjugating you to that experience, but
No, I
I'm also
apologize
not.
for them emoting around it.
Was exactly the reaction I was hoping for. Oh man, yeah, it's arguments like that, and another one is that's popular among that group of apologists is that like, and I'm going a little bit off a little bit tangent here, but the they wouldn't have made up the story of women discovering the tomb empty. I'm like, you have not read anything about ancient Jewish burial practices. If you think that, you haven't even started reading on that topic, if that's what you think. Like, there is so much literature out there about this, and you haven't even touched it. That's how I
The
feel like
question
when
is like, yeah, you
it's like
definitely,
this.
that kind of argument, that historical Jesus argument, the like, people wouldn't make X up argument, always has to be applied to a variety of contexts. And you have to say, like, something that's embarrassing in one like particular, like, one particular philosophical group or religious group in the first century is not necessarily embarrassing to other religious groups or philosophical groups. It may be really compelling to them. Um, so it's sort of the whole kind of you wouldn't make this up thing, or this isn't historical. Well, you got to go do the work before you can figure that out.
Mhm. Yeah, they have no interest in what actually happened in history. They just want to affirm their own positions for whatever their motives may be. Usually, it's a girl.
Yeah,
So
and
what it's
yeah, and and
there's
honestly,
so
it sort of feels to me that for Romans to write counter arguments to the Christian eyewitness reports from the first and second century, they have to one know who Christians are, and two
oh,
care. Like they have to like care about them, and it's not at all clear to me that they even know, much less care about Christians until at least, let's say, 110, 115 CE. And even then, they're not really like especially bothered.
um, we're gonna get into that. Oh, which question? Not this question, but the next question. We're gonna get into
Okay.
that exactly. Um, so before we get into that, um, oh, thank you, Pat. Pat Lowinger in the house. Do you know Pat? He's a archaeologist. He's an historian.
Hi, Pat.
Really he's one of those people that knows like everything about everything. And it's yeah. He makes me want to read more whenever I talk to him. Like, man, I gotta buckle down on my studies, man. Okay.
Benjamin, I will
So
not send you a book before it's released if you martyr yourself, because I wouldn't have the forwarding address for you in heaven. But I might send you a copy early if you just ask. um,
speaking of books that have not been released, Chad, I meant to plug this in the beginning and I forgot to. So this seems like a perfect opportunity. We're not going to go into it, but you have a new book coming out very soon. You and your publishing company blessed me with an early copy of God's Ghostwriters. Um, this has been amazing so far. And we're going to be doing a TikTok live on this Saturday, to talk about it,
no,
I think.
like in March we're doing it, like right before, aren't we?
Oh, it's in March. I wrote it down in February. I'm glad we had this conversation. I was going to be very confused next
I mean,
time.
but like you should all go pre-order the book. But I think we're doing it
Yeah.
like a little closer
Um,
on sale. But yeah,
yeah. So we're going to do a separate interview both on TikTok and here on Nerds and Heresy about this, and it's good. So excited.
do you like it?
I'm trying very hard. I'm trying very hard not to like. I'm exploding. I want to talk about it so bad, but
I worked really hard on this one. I gotta admit, the other books I didn't
oh,
down right,
so
but
good.
I like tried and
So
stuff.
good. Anyway, before I give in to temptation here, um, I want to move on from like the disciples
Mm-hmm.
to the early church and talk about how frequent persecution or how common it really was. I have a graphic. I gotta figure out how to do the share screen thing again real quick, but it's just a picture this time. It's not a video, so we don't have to deal with that. This is a quote from your book. When we look at the data, things are clear. Between the death of Jesus around 30 CE and the ascension of Constantine in 313, Christians died as a result of active measures by the imperial government. Only one immediately followed the Great Fire of Rome in 64, two around 250 during the reign of Decius, three briefly during the reign of Valerian in 257 to 58, and four during the Great Persecution under the Emperor Diocletian, which lasted from 303 to 305, and was renewed by Maximus Dias, or Dei, between 311 and 313. So you laid that out so plainly. And I was like, damn, that's not a lot. Those are not big numbers.
And I'm not even sure that two of those are about Christianity. Like, I'm not really sure that any Christians opposed to Jews die after the Great Fire of Rome under Nero. And then the Decian persecution, as I explained, not about Christians, just a thing that affected Christians particularly.
That's what my question would be about.
It's not very much.
Yeah. So in regard to this quote, can you expound upon what you were saying here and maybe tell us why these numbers seem so small compared to what we're used to hearing?
Well, the reason,
again, growing up the way I grew up, I thought, go ahead.
Yeah, I grew up that way too. Christians were constantly under attack. And then gradually over time, it became clear it was much narrower than I had thought. And I got to tell you, I see Christians online saying that this is just some fringe idea. I think pretty much all historians would go with that group of persecutions. We know that there was no constant persecution. We get that idea from the 4th century from a church historian called Eusebius. It's not very much. The reason we think, and the evidence is from so much later, so the reason we think there was, after the Great Fire of Rome, that Nero targeted Christians is because some early 2nd century writers told us that they did. And then we move on to Decius in 250, and this is to Pat's point about the Lazzi. So in 250, Decius, who's coming hot on the heels of 5 emperors in a very short period of time, is thinking, what can I do to unify the Roman Empire behind me? He's a military guy. So he decides that everyone has to go and make a display of loyalty to the emperor by putting some incense in a flame. Everyone will do that. By everyone, it's not clear exactly who he meant. Did he mean head of household? Did he mean men? Is this only freeborn citizens? But we don't actually have a copy of Decius's edict. Instead, what we have are some little documents of what happened. So if you went and you sprinkle some incense in a flame to show your loyalty to the emperor, you would get a little piece of paper, labellus, that would say that you had done this. And we have copies of those, and it's very clear that some of those belong to like priestesses of Isis. So this is not about Christians. This is about everyone. So if you want to call it Christian persecution, I'm sorry that you cannot, because it's not about Christians. It cannot be Christian persecution if this is a law that applies to everyone. But then let's imagine you were a Christian, to come to Pat's question. You have 4 choices. One is you get executed, you deny being a Christian, and they let you go. You have now become one of the lapsed. You get arrested, you say that you were a Christian, and you end up dying as a martyr, or they imprison you for a while and you get known as a confessor, and then they release you. Another option, if you have the cash, is to go into exile, and a number of very wealthy, high-powered Christian priests and bishops would do that. They would just like go off into exile. And then these are my favorite group, the Stantes. The Stantes, they just kind of stayed home. No one is policing this legislation. No one's like coming to your house and being like, do you have the piece of paper? Did you offer the sacrifice? That did not happen in this period. So the Christians who just like stayed home, just like kept their cool, kept quiet. They felt that they were like the martyrs because they weren't lapsed Christians. They hadn't complied with this arrangement. That's amazing. But the lapsy are fascinating because they would feel bad about this. And so they would go to the prisons where the Christians were imprisoned, and they would ask the confessors who were awaiting execution if the confessors would forgive them. And the confessors would be like, I forgive you for denying Christ. And they'd go away and they'd be like, oh, thank goodness. It caused like a huge problem in the church because should they get off that easily? Right? Like, should they get away with it that easily? And certainly in some places like North Africa, they became a really big issue. Because people just felt like they had it too easy. Later on, during the actual real short period of persecution that we have, the Great Persecution from 303 to 305, which is really the one period that lines up with my like childhood Sunday school image of persecution, which is of legislation that specifically targets Christians, all Christians, not just the powerful, not just the priests, and also that they sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. In that period, you have people apostatizing and then just being forgiven. And everyone sort of talks about themselves as like heirs to this period in the middle of the 3rd century. But the lapsi, the people who had denied Christ and then gone on with their life, I mean, they kind of won because they have their get out of jail free card from the Roman government. And then they have their get out of jail free card from the Christian confessors. And I do think that it's really moving that there would have been people who had confessed to being Christian and explained that as their reason for refusing to offer a sacrifice to the emperor, who would have been willing to forgive people. Because let me tell you, and here's one of the reasons I'm not a saint, if I had done that, if I had accepted execution because of my religious beliefs, and some guy who had apostatized came to me and was like, hey, will you forgive me? I'd be like, oh gosh, too bad, sorry. That would be me. So I do think there's something very moving about that story of forgiveness. But the existence of the lapsi becomes a huge problem in that region of the world for about 100 years.
Interesting.
Pliny
John.
the Younger. Yeah.
Yeah. It was only a matter of time before we got to Pliny the Younger. Only a matter of time.
Oh, Pliny.
Dr. Moss, would you please address the Christians killed by Pliny the Younger, as it says in the 140 AD letter? I've talked about this a few times.
Pliny the Younger, book 10, letters 96 to 97. It's his letter to the emperor Trajan, and Trajan's response. Now, what's fascinating? I just, I know that like you Protestants know your Bible. I know my martyrdom.
It's one thing to have Bible verses memorized, but to have like citations from the early church fathers or early Roman officials like memorized, that's like you're on another level. I'm not even...
you might, someone might think it was my job. Weird. But so when Pliny writes to Trajan, it's very clear there's no legislation out there. Pliny doesn't know what to do. Firstly, his concern is economic. He does not care about what Christians think. He's concerned, he just sunk a ton of cash into building a temple, and apparently no one's going to this pagan temple. And he concludes it's because of the Christians, and he takes these 2 deaconesses who are enslaved women, he tortures them to find out what they think, and he's like, really, there's nothing very unacceptable about this group of people, except that they seem to be affecting the economics of this region. And they're annoying. He calls them stubborn. He says that purely because of their contumacia, the sort of like stubbornness, they deserve to die. And Trajan writes back and goes, yeah, that sounds about right, if they're very annoying, because this is about Roman power. Disrespect Roman power and things won't go well for you. But what's striking about this legislation is Pliny doesn't know what to do. Clearly, there was no Roman position on the Christians before this. And
he's never heard. Pliny was one of the most well-connected people, like in the first century. Or he knew everybody. He was very well connected. So for someone like him to be
He
like,
certainly
I don't know
knows
what to do with
other elites.
Christians.
If there was legislation, he would know about it.
Yeah,
And for
exactly.
sure, given his social circles, he would know. Um, and there wasn't. And it's not as if Trajan writes back and says, well, obviously, here's how we treat Christians. They don't know. They're kind of muddling their way through this. And it's not about what Christians believe, it's about the socioeconomic threat that they pose to this region. It's about the fact that they're meeting at night. Roman emperors do not like people meeting at night. They don't like new clubs because they think that political sedition begins in these kinds of voluntary groups, these clubs.
Yeah, they didn't have
And
freedom of
then,
assembly like we do
yeah,
today.
they don't like any organizations like that. They regularly get banned. And in this period, you're not allowed to join them. And so, in enacting this legislation, this is the first time Christians are on the map. And it shows that there was no previous position on Christians. Let's be clear that if Nero had executed a bunch of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome, why don't Pliny or Trajan know about it? And why hasn't that set any kind of legal precedent? And then the punishment is not about their belief system. And both Pliny and Trajan agree, don't target Christians. Don't allow that to
Yeah,
happen. Don't allow anonymous denunciations of people as being Christian. If someone's
and
going to be
Trajan
accused of being a
tells
Christian,
Pliny, don't go looking for these people.
yeah,
Don't go
don't
hunt
go
them
looking
down.
for these
That
people just
resolves
if
the
they
problem.
show up and they're annoying. Um,
Yeah,
I think it's excellent evidence not of Roman persecution, but of Roman ignorance and Roman tolerance. They're just like, they're fine, don't go looking for them, but if they're annoying, they're annoying.
yeah.
But we
It's
don't have hard data. And also, killing a bunch of two enslaved women is not a big deal under Roman law. That's not that Pliny would execute those women for their stubbornness. They're supposed to be enslaved and obedient, and they're clearly not being that way. There's a lot going on that isn't about religion in those letters.
right.
And there's very little there that's actually about Christian belief.
Even the it makes me think of the even within different Christian communities. Um, oh my God, what are they called? The Donatists that were like the ancient
Mm-hmm.
equivalent of charismatic Pentecostals. They
Yes,
were the ones
Donatists.
running around like speaking in tongues and prophesying and like doing like all the showboaty stuff, and other Christians were like, "Yo, you're drawing too much
Definitely.
attention. Stop." So yeah, even a Christian like they understood we got to keep a low profile and then blend in with the environment.
Right.
Yeah, this reminded me of them. Um, so next question, I'm not really sure how to go about asking this one because when we're getting a little bit political here now because we're nearing the end of your book. Um, when you read all the different sources that we have on this topic, one thing becomes very clear that Roman officials are talking about things very differently than Christians are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the best examples is Tertullian versus Herodian. They're both writing
Mm-hmm.
about the same time. Herodian's harder to tell. But hold on, where did I put that quote? Tertullian said in there it is at 196. If the Tiber rises to the walls, if the Nile fails to rise and the floods the fields, if the sky withholds its rain, if there is earthquake or famine or plague, straightway the cry arises, the Christians to the lions. That is basically him saying we can't do anything. No matter what happens, we're blamed.
Mm-hmm.
Like we now. Meanwhile, you go to again Herodian, who is writing about the same time, and he writes a detailed. Well, I don't know how detailed you could call it, but a broad historiography of the emperors from about the 180s to 230 ish, about the emperors and the struggles that they had during their reign. He never mentions Christians a single time at all. Like, so here you have, and that's just one example of many. We have plenty of records of like Roman governors, lawyers, soldiers, emperors, even, and they're not. And then we have early Christian writers. Early Christian writers are like, we are so persecuted that stop persecuting us. We're all dying. It's just, none of these other Roman officials are talking about them like that. So you get this, you read all this stuff and you can't help but notice a parallel with like today's political discourse, of how you have like the modern conservatives today are running around doing this, saying that we're being silenced, we're being canceled, witch hunt, you know. And reality is that's not happening at all. Not sure where I was going with that. I guess being a yeah, you talked about this at the last chapter of your book, which you titled "The Dangerous Legacy of a Martyrdom Complex," which I love that. How that's worded. What does that mean? Would you say the danger? Kind of what I was talking about, like these people. They as long as they claim they're being persecuted, they can. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So
I know that was a weird
transition.
transition.
By saying something. No, it's fine. The first thing I'm going to do is like correct a misinterpretation and frankly misreading of my work that I see another scholar saying, which is that, so when you think about early Christians, they're not being systematically persecuted, but every once in a while, like a person dies who is a Christian who possibly could have gotten out of it if they had done things differently. And in small Christian communities, even the death of like a single person is sort of quite traumatizing. That doesn't mean early Christians are being persecuted, but you can see that it felt quite dire for them. They're small communities. They are like the minority, and often they don't have a ton of power or cultural capital. And so I do want to say, as I say in the book, just the deaths of a few people would have sort of thrown gasoline on the flames of a martyrdom complex. And those are very sincere feelings. We don't have to call those people like just liars. Although some of the authors of those stories are just straight up lies. And that's okay, because this is how people compose in antiquity. They just make stuff up. But when you see modern people doing this, when you see the modern context that you're talking about, there's been a really big shift in the power dynamics. It's the same through line. Christians are always and everywhere persecuted. Christians are persecuted just for being Christian, just like Jesus prophesied in the New Testament. He said this would happen. And the fact that we're persecuted is evidence that we are right and God is with us. Things are really different now, because Christians are powerful. And so when you have like the powerful majority, as Christians are in this country, especially during, say, like the Trump years, you would, if I was wrong about this martyrdom complex, you would expect that during the Trump years, they would have stopped saying this. But instead, Vice President Pence is giving a sort of speech at Liberty University at their graduation about how they need to shut off persecution because people make fun of them. Also not persecution. And so the dangerous legacy is that people who are powerful, simply because they're not as powerful, think that they are under attack. And when that group is powerful, the sense that you're under attack leads you to believe that your actions are just self-defense, which is horrifying when you're not under attack and you're the powerful group. And so I think that should concern us. The other issue is there are people in other parts of the world who do face real religious persecution. And if Christians genuinely are concerned about that, then they should stop talking about being persecuted here as if what's happening here is the same as what's happening in those other parts of the world. So for me, I think it's like a very dangerous idea. Right now in America, about 77% of white evangelical Christians think that Christians are marginalized in America in as much as or more as any other marginalized group in this country. That's a really big number. Isn't that a really big number? And so I think that's deeply problematic because of how that plays out in our modern world, and also because this like persecution complex it operates independent of any reality. It's self-sustaining. It feeds itself. You don't really need people to be persecuted to think that you are persecuted. And that's sort of a big problem. Yeah, you have a narrative. I think it's politically disruptive.
That's what's so crazy about studying the early Christians who were making this claim, and they were not in power at the time. At times, they did face some genuine persecution, especially under like Diocletian. But once they got power, they immediately flipped the script and started being the ones doing the persecuting.
Right, and yet their attacks on others are still seen as martyrdom. Like destroying a pagan temple, if they die doing that, that's martyrdom. Invading the Holy Land in the First Crusade, if you die during that war, you got the rewards of martyrdom, according to Pope Urban II. Why?
Oh,
you're like
right.
engaged in a war. Like you're in the military. That's not martyrdom, except it was kind of shifted for that. And I think one of the things that's sort of like ironic is that there was nothing about this experience of persecution that led Christians to think that persecuting others was bad. Because, to quote a famous Levantine monk, there is no crime for one who has Christ. You can do whatever you want because you have God on your side.
And it's terrifying to think how much it's scary to think how much of the success of the early church is attributed to that martyrdom complex. Like they were really they really hammered this on for a long time until eventually I don't know.
It's adaptable, right? Because you can very quickly go from people are actively trying to physically harm us to this person disagrees with me, they're persecuting me. And those aren't the same thing at all. Disagreement is not persecution.
Right. Yeah.
But that shift, that equation that begins in the 4th century with Eusebius of Caesarea equating a heretic to a persecutor, well, you just mean someone who disagrees with you about Jesus. Is the same as someone who is trying to throw you to the lions. Are they the same? Really? It's just the same phenomenon. He says it is, which really sort of sets up this template for anyone who disagrees with me. They don't have a reason. They're persecuting me. And that really justifies me to respond in quite dramatic ways because it's self-defense because they're persecuting me. Cheery, uplifting, enjoying your holiday weekend.
It's about to get worse. Where'd I put that? There we go. Okay. My final question for tonight, going off of what you were just saying, you already touched on it a little bit. And then if you guys in the chat have any questions, Canada, however much time you have, if you need to go, cool. I'm tired myself.
I have to go in like 15 minutes, so.
Perfect.
Do your worst.
Y'all got 15 minutes to ask questions. Y'all better buckle up. Okay. Where's this? I don't like change. Why did they change? Okay, here we go. Being a teacher and student of ancient history, how similar is today's political climate with that of the early church? What's different about it? Are we watching history repeat itself in real time? And if so, what hope do we have, if any, that that's not going, that things are not going to turn out the same way that they did back then? Does that make sense?
I mean, is your
I
question
know
in
that's
terms
a
of
lot. I know that's a lot.
not turning out the same way they did back then, which is with like a Christian nation run by a tyrannical emperor?
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping not happens.
Or,
Yeah.
sorry, were you like, wow, she really just said that out loud? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like what when you say like, yeah, the human brain is hardwired to recognize patterns. When you study ancient history, and I'm sure you know this way better than I ever will, but you do recognize patterns when you study ancient history, and then when you're immersed in the political discourse of today, you can't help but be like, this is happening again. There's a lot of similarities to what happened back then to what's um so yeah, what is your observation
Yeah.
on that?
I mean, I see. So the problem about the persecution myth is that if you are the wielder of that tool, if your followers believe that, there's no winning for the other side. So I did an interview on NPR with All Things Considered recently, and in the pre-interview, they asked me, is there anything to be done about the fact that Donald Trump utilizes this sort of persecution rhetoric? He's the quote unquote most attacked political leader of all time, which is like, I
Yeah,
always find funny because I just like think of Julius Caesar and I'm like, I think he might disagree. He might feel like he's the most attacked political leader. But when he says that, when he
literally
says, yeah, exactly. He says,
in the
how many
mouth
people have stabbed you,
with
Donald?
a sharp piece of
Um,
metal.
right. Like it just, um, so when you see that, they asked me, when you see all of this, they wanted me to explain, like, where does this come from? So I explained as we've been discussing this evening. And they said, and we didn't actually talk about this in the show, is there anything to be do to stop it? I said, the problem is that it's self-mobilizing and that his followers are already working in this framework. They've heard this on Sundays from the pulpit. They already have this persecution framework. 77% of them already believe that Christians are marginalized in this country. And then any kind of action against former President Trump is not understood to be legal action for crimes that he has committed or things that he did. It is instead unjust targeting. They do think that a crime has been committed, but the crime that's been committed is the unjust targeting of former President Trump in their mind. What do you do? And it's very hard to know because the more you can always dismiss the evidence. You can always say this was forged, it was fabricated, this is a witch hunt. And he's been priming the pump on that since he was elected in 2016.
Oh yeah.
He's been doing that throughout the whole presidency. And I think, I mean, what I said at the time is only one of two things could happen. The first would be that someone would come forward with a recording of him or some kind of indisputable like testimony that he had, it seems to me that in America, the most heinous religious crime that you could commit against God would be to have or finance an abortion. So if he had done that since his alleged conversion to Christianity, whenever that took place, because before his election, to be sure, then that might work. But the only other thing that seems to me that dispels this is just conversation between people. Like, we're very polarized. I've been on Fox News a few times. It was pretty terrifying. But it felt to me like a thing that was worthwhile, like worth doing, because these are the people that I should want to talk to. Like when I go to when I go to an academic conference, I'm talking to a bunch of other scholars about nerdy things that we believe in, and we generally have sort of similar political opinions. Same with most of my friends and family members, but that's sort of where you have to go. You have to go to sort of where there is disagreement and have those conversations one-on-one in as calm a manner as you can. When I went on O'Reilly's show, I was told to make sure you smile and don't get heated, because they'll just portray you as, can I swear on here? Like, what's the?
No, please.
Yeah, they'll just say that you're like a quote unquote fucking bitch. That's how they'll portray you. So just be nice. So I smiled a lot. So just keep smiling, just keep smiling, just be nice, just be nice. So I think that in terms of like, are we going to end up in the same place? Dear Lord, I hope not, right? Because Constantine did some very messed up things. But what would Donald Trump do? Good Lord. And, sort of, I believe in, a democratic system. I believe in, the republic. So I certainly hope not. And when people ask me, as they have done, well, how do you diffuse this very powerful rhetorical weapon in the arsenal of the religious right and particular kinds of conservative? I say, all you can do it is like one-on-one conversation. Just that involves like getting out of our like familiar backyards.
Interesting.
Okay. I wish she hadn't said that. Am I losing you followers?
No. There's some people that, like, sometimes I wish I could entertain some of these people, these fringe ideas. And other times I'm afraid I would just tell them to shut the fuck up and they're dumb as shit. And I have two sides, Some days I want to build bridges of communication. Other days I just want to be like, fuck you, fuck your couch. You're dumb as shit. I have no interest in giving you the airtime. It's very two sides of the same coin, I guess. Okay.
Can I answer John McQuelly's question?
Yes, please.
So what do I think of Clement?
Oh, that's a good one.
Paul and Peter. So probably end of the 1st century, there's a text known as First Clement. I agree, Riley, that was one hell of a line. There's this text known as First Clement that describes Peter and Paul as dying on account of jealousy. And the Greek word for jealousy there, in the same way as people use jealousy and envy differently today, people use that language of jealousy to refer to kind of intercommunal strife, which would suggest that Peter and Paul die as a result of kind of communal discord and disagreement over whatever. You could imagine that they would ruffle feathers wherever they went. And so I don't think that Clement is claiming that they were martyred on account of external political factors. I think Clement is arguing the opposite. And I get this idea from a scholar called David Eastman, who's written an article on this. It's probably on his academia.edu page if you're interested. And he also mentions it in his book on Paul the Martyr. He talks about how this idea about Paul is actually what Clement is saying is that they are being executed on account of sort of infighting in the group of Christians, not because of some kind of persecution.
Cool. I'm gonna have to think about that more.
It's a kind of philological, linguistic argument, but it makes a certain amount of sense.
Yeah.
There are some questions. There's a skeptical German scholar who wonders if Peter ever got to Rome at all. If you were raised Roman Catholic or are Roman Catholic like me, you're probably like, ouch.
Blasphemy. Yeah.
Well, because if he doesn't get to Rome, it's like a smidge of a problem for what's happening there today. John D, yes, his name is David Eastman. He definitely has an academia.edu page, but also if you email me, I definitely have these articles. I have the stuff. I can email it to you. I'm super easy to find. Not many people make the mistake of naming their daughter Candida Moss.
Okay. I just drummed up one last question for you, and then I'll let you go.
Mm-hmm.
What is one position that you hold or you argue for that might put you in the minority among your colleagues as a scholar? Like, what position do you hold that might be considered fringe? Is there anything that like do do you rock the boat in any certain like Acts wasn't actually written by the same author as Luke or
Yeah, like scholars,
exactly?
like that would put me in the scholarly fringe as opposed to the mainstream fringe, the like
Yeah, yeah,
religious
so yeah,
fringe.
like yeah.
Yeah,
I'm trying to get in the weeds here. Where do you diverge?
yeah,
This is always, this is
um,
like one of my favorite things to learn about scholars. Is like, oh wow, that's an interesting, yeah.
uh, I don't know because like it seems to me like scholarship's always divided. So the fringe is always actually like, very, very small. It's such a good question
And
that
it's always
I think
changing.
if I really thought what people think I say about martyrdom, that it's all made up, that would make me fringe. But I don't say that. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the next book. Um, I think, and maybe this puts me, this is pretty fringe, but let's see what they think when they read the arguments. I think that secretaries are actively involved in the composition of texts. I don't think that they're like mere vessels for the author. And certainly, I mean, it's not as if there are people out there disagreeing with me yet, but there's certainly going to be. So I think that might
I,
make me cringe. Um,
I know where you're going with this.
but
Yeah,
we'll
I think.
see. I mean, let's see what happens next time we talk. I might be like, on a lot of Valium as a result of this.
I remember uh, this was quite a while ago when I read Bart Ehrman's book, misquoting Jesus like everybody does, and he mentions in passing like you'll blink if you miss it. He says that sometimes slaves copied manuscripts as part of their daily chores, and that's like all he says about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like I distinctly remember reading that and be like, hold on, what? I have so many questions. We need to talk more. Someone needs to write a book about this specifically, and lo and behold, you did. Uh, and it's everything I hoped it would be. And I'm very
Thank
excited to
you. And
finish it.
I asked him about that. I was like, "Who do you like?" I asked him about the social status thing, and I think he just wasn't. He just wasn't thinking about it. He just wasn't interested in that question. What he said was, "I haven't really thought about that." So here we are.
Oh. This was his book too, right?
Yeah, I think, and that's okay. Like, no one has
So
to
he
talk
wasn't he
about
wasn't like
everything.
super getting into the weeds things. Yeah, seemed like.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah.
Benjamin Britten, you'll see when you read the book, you'll see about writing via scribes. To John McCrawley, I take all peer-reviewed scholarship seriously, but I'm not a ethicist. I don't I
yeah.
don't I don't follow the argument. There are better or worse versions of the argument, but I
No,
get a lot of hate mail from ethicists. So
you will. Mythicists are y'all are fucking dumb, and I have no problem saying that. Y'all are like I have no mercy for them. And I say that because they're the most. They're like hardcore Muslims. They'll come into my comments and just spew the most hateful shit. It doesn't matter what I talk about in my video. I could be talking about like the dating of the Book of Revelation, and I'd be like, "Well, Jesus never existed anyway, and why would you think that?" Like, yeah, no, I have no patience for them anymore. Y'all are wrong. You're dumb, and I'm not afraid to say it.
yeah, it feels quite
Anyway,
it feels quite heated.
I mean, you can say that because you're a professional, but I will
Uh-huh.
say that because I'm just an edgy internet atheist with a YouTube channel. Yeah,
Well, I wouldn't be here if I didn't respect you. I do not say yes to every invite I get. I'm not like going to the opening of
sorry if I
Everest,
came off strong there.
I'm
I
like,
heard strong things about.
no, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I want to respect your time and let you go. I know you got an actual
Mhm.
teaching job that you do every day.
Yeah,
Um,
it's weird. It's like,
all right. I just have to get up in the morning and make my kids breakfast and get them ready for the bus. And then I have to sweep and mop and do dishes and laundry. And
Are your kids going to school tomorrow? I feel like I should tell you about the national holiday.
I'm hoping. So I had one kid who was out with a flu for a week, and he went back to school on like Thursday. And then a few hours later, I got a phone call from another that one of my other kids has pink eye, so I had to come get him. And then there was
the pink eye
on Friday, so it was just like it doesn't end. Anyway, huge thank you for coming on. Really, this was
thank you for having
a
me.
lot of fun. I'm sorry if I rambled a lot and have trouble organizing my thoughts sometimes.
You didn't ramble. This was fun.
Good. Yeah, I'm very excited for our upcoming interviews.
I know.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting.
Y'all in the chat, follow Candida Moss on all of her social goings on. Links in the description. Buy her shit. Do it. It's worth it. It really
Please
is.
buy the new book, especially.
I don't say that
Riley.
about every but yeah. Good stuff if you're interested in these types of topics. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Hold on. Where's my? I gotta load up my outro. Okay. Love you guys. Y'all have a good night.
Hold on to your butts.